3 words, posted on social media on the night of April 13th, 2026, by a former special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who has been publicly analyzing this case since the first week of the investigation. 3 words that no law enforcement official, no investigative body, no press conference, and no official statement has said publicly in 7 to 3 days. Nancy sadly died. That is what Jennifer Coffindaffer wrote, not as speculation clearly labeled as her personal theory, not as one of several possible scenarios she was weighing. She wrote it as a conclusion drawn from what law enforcement has told her. She prefaced it with a statement that has received less analytical attention than the 3 words that followed it. Law enforcement said they know the motive for the abduction of Nancy, and they have known it from the beginning. Stop at that sentence before moving to the 3 words, because that sentence is doing something that no other public statement about this case has done. It attributes knowledge to law enforcement, not theory, not working hypothesis, not reasonable belief. Knowledge, they know the motive. They have known it from the beginning. And the motive is kidnapping for ransom. And the 3 words that followed describe what Coffindaffer believes happened to Nancy Guthrie when the ransom was not paid and when no proof of life was produced, and when the perpetrators found themselves holding an 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker and limited mobility and a heart condition that required daily medication in a location that has still not been identified, without any path forward that they had planned for. Before this analysis goes any further, there is a woman at the center of this story who must be named and held with respect. Nancy Ellen Guthrie, born January 27th, 1942, 84 years old, someone's mother, someone's grandmother, a woman who had dinner with her daughter Annie at approximately 9:45 in the evening on January 31st, 2026, and who was dropped off at her own home and went inside. A woman whose pacemaker disconnected from her phone at 2:28 in the morning on February 1st, 16 minutes after a masked man approached her front door at 2:12. A woman whose blood was found on her front porch. A woman who needed daily heart medication and had limited mobility, and who has been missing for 73 days. Whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie, she deserved to be found. She deserved to be brought home. She deserved to have every possible forensic and investigative resource applied to finding her in time to matter. This video is built on that foundation. If you have followed this channel's coverage of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, you have watched each piece of evidence in this case accumulate across multiple videos, each one building on the last. The Google footage recovery, the Bitcoin blockchain, the complex DNA mixture, the Byte flashlight. Each video in this series ended with the investigation at a technical frontier where the available tools were approaching the answer without yet reaching it. This video is different. This video is not about tools approaching an answer. This video is about what a former FBI agent says law enforcement already knows, and about the question that knowledge raises about why 7 to 3 days of investigation have not produced a public arrest. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to follow this case with the depth the daily coverage cannot provide. And leave a comment before we go further. When Jennifer Coffindaffer says law enforcement has known the motive from the beginning, what does that tell you about what the investigation's public silence has been protecting? Let's start with who Jennifer Coffindaffer is and why her statement on April 13th carries the weight it does. Because the credibility of a source is inseparable from the weight you give their words. Jennifer Coffindaffer is a former special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She served with the Bureau for 24 years. During that tenure, she worked counterterrorism, violent crime, public corruption, and investigations that required the kind of institutional knowledge about how federal law enforcement handles kidnapping. cases that comes only from direct experience inside the system. Since retiring, she has been a public analyst on high-profile cases and has appeared in coverage of this investigation from its earliest weeks. She has been commenting on the Nancy Guthrie case through her social media accounts and public appearances since shortly after the disappearance was reported. She is not a content creator speculating from the outside. She is someone with direct knowledge of how the FBI approaches kidnapping cases, how ransom investigations are structured, what the Bureau's policy is on ransom payment, and what the statistical and operational reality of elderly abduction cases looks like from inside the system that handles them. When she says law enforcement told her they know the motive and have known it from the beginning, that is a statement made by someone who understands what that institutional knowledge means and what its implications are. Her April 13th post on X laid out a timeline that was precise and sequential. Abduction February 1st. Ransom note to local media February 2nd. Ransom note to TMZ February 3rd. Kidnapping for ransom. Nancy sadly died. The kidnappers did not care and tortured the family with 2 notes, knowing the FBI would not recommend paying a ransom without proof of life. Like most cases, this one is simple, but everyone wants to make it complex. That last sentence deserves its own examination because it is directed at something specific. The coverage of this case, including from this channel, has focused heavily on the technical complexity of the evidence. The Google backend architecture, the deconvolution software that does not exist, the Bitcoin blockchain trace, the Byte flashlight, and the saliva source. All of that analysis is factually accurate and analytically legitimate. But Coffindaffer is arguing that the complexity of the evidence picture does not reflect complexity in the crime itself. The crime was simple. Someone planned a kidnapping for financial gain, targeting the elderly mother of a nationally known television personality. The crime required operational preparation, a masked approach, disabling the camera, knowing the property well enough to execute the plan, but the motive was not sophisticated. The motive was money. Now, let us examine the ransom note timeline she laid out. Because this specific sequence has not been assembled in this way in any previous coverage of this case, and the sequence itself tells a story. The abduction occurred in the early hours of February 1st. The ransom note to local media arrived February 2nd. The ransom note to TMZ arrived February 3rd. 2 notes in the first 48 hours after the abduction. Neither note to either outlet came with proof of life. The family received communications as well, according to Savannah Guthrie's March 26th interview with Hoda Kotb. Savannah said the family received some notes they believed were fraudulent, and to that she and her siblings believed were real. She said the family was ready and willing to pay for the right information, but the FBI does not recommend paying ransom without proof of life. This is not a bureaucratic policy. It is the operational standard derived from decades of kidnapping case outcomes. Paying without proof of life does not guarantee the person's return. It guarantees payment to people who may no longer have anyone to return, and no proof of life was ever provided. Not in February, not in March, not in the April 6th TMZ notes that claimed simultaneously that Nancy was dead and that the sender had seen her alive in Sonora, Mexico. Not at any point in 73 days of correspondence, tips, public appeals, and million-dollar reward offers, no verified photograph, no audio, no video, no physical token, no specific piece of information that only Nancy could have provided. Nothing that established to law enforcement's satisfaction that the person being negotiated, FOR, was still alive and reachable. Coffindaffer's reading of that absence is direct. The kidnappers sent notes knowing the FBI would not recommend payment without proof of life. They sent notes to multiple outlets simultaneously. They sent notes that contained no proof because they had no proof to provide, because Nancy was no longer alive to provide it. This reading aligns with something that Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos said publicly in March that was reported but not analyzed with the weight it deserved. He said investigators believe they know why this was done and they believe it was targeted. He said he was not 100% sure but believed the attack was specific and deliberate. He also warned that whoever did this may strike again, which implies a perpetrator profile whose behavior is not bounded by a single ransom objective. Those two statements from Nanos, that he knows the why and that the perpetrator may strike again, are not easy to reconcile with a theory in which the motive was purely financial and the crime was concluded. Coffindaffer's reading of a concluded crime, one where Nancy died and the perpetrators moved on, does not fit cleanly with Nanos's warning about a perpetrator who might strike again. This is what legal expert Chad Cummings described publicly as a case of competing realities. Savannah Guthrie's framework, articulated in her March interview with Hodakotp, is that her mother was targeted for ransom because of Savannah's public profile. Her brother Cameron believed it from the first moments. Savannah said she pressed him on whether it was because of her and he told her yes, maybe. She said she woke up every night in the middle of the night in the darkness imagining her mother's terror. That is the framework of someone who believes her mother was taken by people who wanted money and who may have had her alive for some period of time. Nanos's framework, articulated across multiple press conferences, is targeted but with a perpetrator who may repeat the behavior. That is the framework of someone who believes the motive was something beyond a single financial transaction, someone whose criminal pattern would apply to other targets. Coffindaffer's framework, stated April 13th, is the simplest of the three: kidnapping for ransom. No proof of life because there was no life to prove. Notes sent to torture a family by people who understood the FBI's policy well enough to know the notes would be unanswerable without what they could not provide. And an investigation that has known this from the beginning and has been working the evidence toward an identification of who did it rather than toward finding Nancy alive. All three frameworks are name-source public statements. None of them has been confirmed as the official investigative theory. What Coffindaffer's statement does, that the others did not, is name the conclusion that the evidence has been building toward for 73 days and that no official body has been willing to say publicly. Now let us examine why that public silence has been maintained for 73 days and what maintaining it tells us about the state of the investigation. There are specific reasons why law enforcement maintains public silence about a victim's likely fate even when investigators have a working assessment of that fate. The first reason is evidentiary. If investigators believe Nancy died but have not located her remains, stating that publicly closes certain investigative doors, tips that might come from people who believe she could be alive and who therefore have reason to report a potential sighting would stop coming in. The behavioral dynamic around the $1.2 million reward changes when the public believes the case has shifted from a rescue to a recovery. Information sources that might provide intelligence about a living person in a specific location become less relevant. When the frame shifts to finding physical remains rather than finding a person. The second reason is prosecutorial, stating publicly that the victim is believed to be dead before physical evidence confirms that death establishes a narrative that defense attorneys will probe aggressively in any future trial. If law enforcement says she is probably dead and then cannot produce the physical evidence to prove cause and manner of death, they have created a gap in their own prosecutorial case. The silence protects the integrity of a future prosecution by forcing any defense to argue against what the evidence shows rather than against what officials said. The third reason is the family. Savannah Guthrie said publicly that she wakes up every night imagining her mother's terror. She said they are in agony. She said it is unbearable. The family has not been told publicly what law enforcement believes, or if they have been told privately, they have not chosen to state it publicly. Maintaining hope, however agonizing, may be the framework the family is operating from. And law enforcement has no obligation to undercut that framework publicly when the evidence has not yet produced the physical confirmation. That would transform a working assessment into an official finding. What Coffindaffer's statement does is break that silence from outside the official structure. She is not the FBI. She is not the Pima County Sheriff's Department. She is a former agent speaking from her own analysis of information she says law enforcement has shared with her. Her statement does not carry the institutional weight of an official finding, but it carries the analytical weight of someone who has direct experience with how these cases end and who has been told by people inside the investigation that the motive has been known from the beginning. And the motive matters, because if the motive was kidnapping for ransom, and if no ransom was ever paid, and if no proof of life was ever provided, and if the first note arrived within 24 hours of the abduction, then the behavioral profile of this crime is consistent with a specific pattern that experienced investigators recognize. A target selected for financial leverage, an approach that was operationally prepared, an execution that went according to a plan, and an aftermath where the plan did not account for the reality that the FBI's standard protocol for ransom, without proof of life, is non-payment, which left the perpetrators with a specific problem they had not solved for before they executed the abduction. Former Orange County Prosecutor Matt Murphy, speaking publicly in April on the Professor Joe Explains YouTube channel, said he would bet everything that the perpetrator is a known repeat offender already in the Pima County jail system. He pointed to the interior of the home, described by sources as immaculate with no signs of assault inside. He pointed to the operational preparation visible in the footage. The mask, the gloves, the backpack, the deliberate approach to the camera, the flashlight held in the teeth for hands-free operation. He pointed to the familiarity with the property that the approach suggests. These are not the markers of an impulsive crime. They are the markers of someone who has done criminal operations before and who has a mental model for how abductions work. Murphy's career, criminal profile, and Coffindaffer's kidnapping for ransom framework are not incompatible. A career criminal with experience in criminal operations would be exactly the profile that would attempt a targeted kidnapping for ransom against an elderly woman connected to a publicly visible family. The operational preparation suggests someone who knows how to plan a crime. The absence of proof of life and the sending of ransom notes without it suggests someone whose plan did not include a contingency for the victim not surviving the abduction. There is one more element of the Coffindaffer statement that deserves specific attention and that has not been examined in the coverage of her post. She said the kidnappers did not care and tortured the family with 2 notes. The word tortured is not casual. It is a specific behavioral characterization of the note sending as an act of deliberate cruelty toward the family rather than as a genuine attempt to negotiate. Someone who sends ransom notes without proof of life, knowing that the FBI's standard is non-payment without proof of life, is not negotiating. They are either communicating from a position of desperation about what they have lost and trying to extract some value from a situation that went wrong, or they are communicating from a position of cruelty toward the family because the family is a target of the victimization, regardless of whether the ransom is paid, or both. The TMZ correspondence, which this series analyzed in detail in an earlier video, has some of both elements. Harvey Levin, who has read every note for more than 60 days, said publicly that the de-escalation of urgency in the second note in early February, where the sender said time is no longer of the essence the day after establishing urgency, suggested to him that Nancy may have already been gone. If the sender knew on February 2nd that time was no longer of the essence, and if that knowledge reflected the reality of Nancy's status, then the notes that followed, through February, through March, through the April 6th return with the body claim and the Sonora sighting, were not negotiations. They were something else. Either a person with genuine knowledge of what happened communicating in coded and indirect language about events they witnessed or participated in, or a person communicating deliberately to cause maximum uncertainty and pain to a family that had no way to verify or refute what was being said. Coffinduffer says the latter. She says the two notes she references were sent to torture the family. Whether the TMZ correspondence represents those two notes or a different category of communication. The behavioral characterization she is making is of perpetrators who understood how the FBI handles ransom cases and who used that understanding not to negotiate but to inflict suffering without risk of being caught. Now let us examine what the institutional collapse of the Pima County Sheriff's Department means in the context of Coffinduffer's statement. Because if law enforcement has known the motive from the beginning, and if the investigation's public purpose has shifted from rescue to identification and prosecution of the perpetrators, then the institutional collapse around the sheriff who is leading that investigation takes on a different weight. Sheriff Chris Nanos has until April 21st, 1 week from today, to provide sworn testimony to the Pima County Board of Supervisors about his employment history, his disciplinary record, and his department's operations. The board voted unanimously to invoke a territorial era Arizona law that allows them to require this testimony, if he does not comply. The board has stated it believes it has the legal authority to vacate the office and remove him from his position. The questions Nanos must answer include his record at the El Paso Police Department in the late 1970s and early 1980s, where documents show he was suspended 8 times for a total of 34 days, including once for excessive force, and where he resigned in lieu of termination in 1982, 2 years before the date on his publicly posted resume. The board has also referred what it believes are perjury issues to the Arizona Attorney General and to the Department of Justice, based on statements Nanos made in a sworn deposition in December 2025 that contradict the public record. A high-ranking official within the Pima County Sheriff's Department told the Daily Express US on April 12 that the Homicide Division working the Nancy Guthrie case has been intentionally kept short-staffed. The official described the department as super quiet, with no meaningful investigative updates. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffinduffer said publicly that the Board of Supervisors process is a huge distraction from the case. She noted that if Nanos is getting good counsel, he will respond only in writing, and that compiling the answers will require significant time from the sheriff and his staff at precisely the moment when the investigation should be at its most intensive phase as it enters its 3rd month with no arrest. This is the institutional picture that surrounds Coffinduffer's statement. A sheriff who may have misrepresented his background to get the job he currently holds. A homicide division described by an insider as intentionally short-staffed. A deadline in 7 days that could result in the removal of the person leading the investigation. And a former FBI agent saying publicly that investigators have known the motive from the beginning, which implies that the barrier to an arrest is not knowledge of the motive but the ability to build an evidential case strong enough to prosecute. The DNA mixture that cannot currently be deconvoluted. The Bitcoin blockchain that was never activated by a payment. The Google footage recovery still ongoing for additional cameras. The Byte flashlight that may or may not have been specifically swabbed. The investigation's technical evidence is extensive and sophisticated, and none of it has yet produced a name. The motive has been known from the beginning, according to Coffindaffer. The perpetrators have not been publicly identified. The gap between knowing why and knowing who is where this investigation has been living for 73 days. Coffindaffer ended her statement with a reference to Occam's razor, the problem-solving principle that favors the simplest explanation that fits the known facts. Her argument is that the simplest explanation has been available since February 3rd. Kidnapping for ransom. No proof of life because there was no life to prove. Notes sent to a family who could not respond because the FBI's protocol requires what the perpetrators could not provide. And an investigation that has been working toward identifying who did it, not toward finding someone alive, since the evidence made the simpler explanation the only sustainable one. Whether Coffindaffer is correct cannot be confirmed from outside the investigation. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has repeatedly declined to confirm its working theory. The FBI does not comment on active cases. The Guthrie family is still publicly maintaining the framework of hope. $1 million in family reward and $100,000 in FBI reward remain active. Tips are still being accepted. The investigation is still officially open and active with no arrest. What can be confirmed is that a former FBI special agent with 24 years of institutional experience said publicly on April 13th that law enforcement has known the motive from the beginning and that Nancy sadly died. That statement, made by that person on that date, represents the clearest articulation of what the investigative community's private assessment of this case appears to be. And the fact that it was said publicly by someone with that background, rather than remaining confined to private conversations among investigators, is itself a development that deserves the analytical weight this channel is giving it. Nancy Guthrie went to dinner with her daughter on the evening of January 31st. Came home. The back doors of her house were propped open when her family arrived the next day. Her blood was on the front porch. Her pacemaker stopped transmitting at 28 in the morning. And 73 days later, a former FBI agent said publicly what 3 words would mean if they are accurate. That she is not coming home the way her family has been hoping, but that the people who took her will still be found. The evidence being built across digital forensics, biological material, blockchain transactions, and surveillance footage exists not only to identify the perpetrators but to put them in front of a jury with a case they cannot answer. That is the investigative purpose that every tool discussed in this series has been serving. Nancy deserves that justice. Her family deserves that closure. And the investigation that has known the motive from the beginning deserves to reach the conclusion that the evidence is building toward. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, contact the FBI immediately at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov. The Guthrie family's $1 million reward and the FBI's $100,000 reward are both still active. Every tip matters, not only because it might identify a person, but because it might provide the physical evidence that confirms what investigators believe they already know. If this analysis gave you something the daily coverage has not, hit the like button right now and subscribe. We will be here on April 21st when the Board of Supervisors deadline for Sheriff Nanos arrives. And we will be here when the investigation produces the arrest that the evidence is building toward. Drop a comment and tell me, when Coffindaffer says law enforcement has known the motive from the beginning and knew it from day one, does that change how you see the 73 days of public silence? And share this with someone who has been following this case since February, because the statement made on April 13th may be the most significant thing any named credentialed source has said about this investigation since the footage was released in February.